In this roundup of the week, as Professor Lockdown falls from grace, the computer model that kept people off the streets comes under fierce attack. The global COVID-19 blame game goes up by 10 notches, and the new research that challenges our theories of why insects may be in decline. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Welcome back to the extended bad hair day that is 2020. I hope you're doing well and dodging the virus. We started last week with a tweet by disruptive entrepreneur Elon Musk, and here we are again. This week, Musk slightly baffled the world by announcing the name of his newly born child. Here's the name, shown on the screen, because nobody knows how to pronounce it. In so doing, Musk and his partner Grimes join that exquisite rank of celebrities, such as Bob Geldof, father of Fifi Trixibel and Peaches Honey Blossom, and Kanye West and Kim Kardashian, parents of Northwest, as people who should probably not be allowed to breed. Maybe these people were bullied at school and felt like it had a beneficial effect on their character development, and so wanted to guarantee that their offspring would have the same opportunities. I have no idea. Musk, who has been a vocal critic of lockdown, made a slightly more substantive Twitter contribution this week when he attacked the UK's Professor of Epidemiology, Neil Ferguson, calling him a tool. This guy has caused massive strife to the world with his absurdly fake science, he said. Now, this was unlikely to be counted as the low light of Ferguson's week, as he veered straight from being highly respected, influencing the core of government policy and being the public face of lockdown, to joining the ranks of people who will always have the label disgraced attached whenever their name gets mentioned. The salacious part of this is that the professor in charge of the lockdown was caught out being visited by his married lover, a professional campaigner who was probably not particularly delighted to find her face on all the front pages of the tabloid press. He promptly resigned as government advisor. Nobody tried to talk him out of it. The more significant part of this is what underpins his role, because the evidence is that it was his computer modelling report that first prompted UK Prime Minister Johnson to abandon the Sweden-like approach it had been following and to jump into full lockdown. The report suggested that the UK could see 500,000 deaths from coronavirus if the country didn't take a more vigorous action on social distancing. This was the moment when Johnson, ashen-faced, declared that the country would be changing tack. It's probably also the moment when it seems that Ferguson likely infected the whole senior team leading the government response with the actual virus, which is kind of an unfortunate by and by. The integrity of Ferguson's model has come under some fairly vigorous attack, and it matters for a number of reasons, not least because his work was influential on the responses made by lots of countries. There were some sceptical voices raised about Ferguson's predictions before, but the virus has made certain conversations difficult, because certainly if you raised sceptical questions in the early days, you would be accused of being reckless towards the fate of all those people that are going to die. But since Ferguson's fall, the critical voices have been raised somewhat. A number of these just focused on the public track record of estimating high on previous diseases. So, for instance, in 2002, Ferguson produced a report on BSE, mad cow disease, and his modelling then suggested that up to 150,000 people would die, whereas in fact it was fewer than 200. And that's a big gap. I mean, you'll always get the phenomenon where modellers are accused of overestimating, because if I say, this is going to happen if we do nothing, what tends to then follow is that we do what was recommended. We don't do nothing. Then people look at the outcome, which is considerably less than the original number, and they say, what a rubbish prediction, ignoring the fact that it was a prediction of circumstances that we then avoided. But it's hard to argue that the gap between ineffective and effective responses to BSE was 150,000 or 200. And there's a certain reality when it comes to modelling pandemics, which is that you'll rarely get fired for overstating the risk. But if you suggest that hardly anyone's going to die and then hundreds of thousands do, then you're in big trouble. But this week there was also a much more targeted takedown of his model by a former senior Google software engineer who reviewed the code. At least she reviewed the amended code. It seems that the actual code which he used to produce his now famous report was a single 15,000 line file that he'd worked on for a decade. If you know anything about professional coding practices, that's extremely bad practice. You should break the code up into functional modules. Everything would be extensively commented and documented so that other programmers could understand the code quickly and help to continue to develop it. Ferguson hasn't released that original code into the public domain, but it had been shared with Microsoft so that they could clean it up into a form when it could be made public. So it was a work in progress in that exercise that the reviewer Sue Denim was able to access. What she rather caustically criticised, however, was that the program had bugs that meant it could produce very different results given identical inputs. She said, "They routinely act as if this is unimportant, suggesting to the contrary that it made it unusable for scientific purposes, given that a key part of the scientific method is the ability to replicate results. Without replication, the findings might not be real at all." The documentation says that the model is stochastic, which means that it injects a certain amount of random variation. So it says multiple runs with different seeds should be undertaken to see average behaviour. Now that sort of makes sense, because obviously you're modelling a big, inconsistent, slightly chaotic mass of humanity, accepting that some levels of precision are not going to be available and doing a number of runs to see where the consistent outcomes are and where the wildly variant outcomes are. I guess that could be useful. I mean, maybe. I don't know if that's right or not because I'm not an expert in modelling. But in any case, according to Sue Denim, that's not actually what happens. For instance, one of the teams working on the code found and documented that when they ran the program multiple times with identical inputs, the resulting predictions varied by around 80,000 deaths after 80 days, which is obviously a huge difference. Apparently, the Imperial team, which is Ferguson's team, said that it didn't matter. They were aware of some small non-determinisms. This has historically been considered acceptable because of the general stochastic nature of the model, which is like saying, we know that the model has bugs that makes it do random stuff, but that's okay, because we just defined that the model works by doing some random stuff. And she said this was just an example. In fact, she said, because their code is so deeply riddled with similar bugs, and they struggled so much to fix them, they got into the habit of simply averaging the results of multiple runs to cover it up, and eventually this behaviour became normalised within the team. And whilst claiming that this behaviour wasn't a problem, they're nevertheless fixing the bugs whenever they find them. And she summed it up like this: they know their code can't withstand scrutiny, so they hid it until professionals had a chance to fix it. But the damage from over a decade of amateur hobby programming is so extensive that even Microsoft were unable to make it run right. Now, it's not really an indictment on Neil Ferguson that his code base is poor. When it was first produced decades ago, a lot of the good practices now followed in coding were not around or not as common. And it bears the hallmark of a project that was done by an individual to solve an immediate problem that was never intended to be shared, and then it grew and it grew and it seemed to be useful for new problems. I get all that. None of that makes it fit for purpose for the formation of public policy in 2020 faced with the COVID-19 epidemic. Old, buggy code is not the basis on which to lock down a country, or indeed half the world. Obviously, this has some of the regular critics jumping up and down. The code review was published, for instance, on Toby Young's Lockdown Skeptics website. In their view, the country entered lockdown on the basis of faulty data, and it was therefore just one big, huge mistake. I don't know that this criticism takes us very far, though. The figures in the UK, even with the lockdown, have been pretty bad, and rather bafflingly from my point of view, have remained plateaued at pretty bad for an extended period of time. The UK is now displaying the second worst absolute death rate in the world, which isn't the important measure, but even with the more important measure of deaths per capita, deaths per million as it's recorded, it's in the top 5 and continuing to advance quicker than most of the rest. What we don't know is what the figures would have been if we hadn't gone into lockdown. We know that Sweden didn't, and Norway and Denmark did, and the rate of growth of cases and the persistence of that growth probably reflects a significant difference that could be attributed to those policies. But we don't know for sure because, as I say every week, every country is different, including the Scandinavian ones. Different demographics, different city density, different factors such as obesity rates. The point is, if Ferguson's model had shown figures that reflected exactly the reality of the data that we've seen since, would we have gone into lockdown or not? Would we have been as confident in our course as Sweden has been, as our figures went higher and faster than every other country? We already have high-profile figures such as Piers Morgan filling the airwaves in the tabloid newspapers, accusing the government of bungling the crisis and letting many thousands more die than otherwise would have. So do we really think we'd be in a very different place without Ferguson's original model? I mean, we can't know because we can't run split A/B testing on reality. I'm willing to bet that, like every other country but Sweden, we would probably have ended up much in the same position. Whether you personally agree that it was the right decision or not, what I'm getting at is it was probably, politically speaking, inevitable when various other countries are doing similar things. The one thing I will say on this, though, is that I have become more and more irritated when the government continually repeats the mantra, we're following exactly what the science says. It's not the job of the leadership of a country just to follow what the scientists say, because the science can only give you data and projections. It can't tell you what you should do about it. And I say the same on climate change before you even mention it. Policy needs to be informed by the science. The science is crucially important, don't get me wrong. But whatever people think, the science doesn't automatically lead to one single obviously correct policy position. There comes a point where leaders have to lead. And that leadership often involves factors in addition to the science. And there are sometimes difficult trade-offs. And there are some political realities that can't be ignored. And that also means that if you do get dodgy input from faulty science, maybe that's what's happened here. I say maybe because there hasn't yet been a response to the criticisms of the imperial model. We shouldn't assume they can't be rebutted. But when you do get bad advice, it always helps if that's not the single basket you put all of your eggs into. In any case, no political leader should think that they won't get the blame if things go wrong just because they can argue they were following the science. And blame is the key battleground that's edging its way into view this week, with the war on words between US and China and Europe becoming more and more angry and extreme. Indeed, worldwide, people have been indulging in what the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres called a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating and scaremongering, as various groups found ways to pin the blame for COVID-19 on whichever groups they traditionally don't get along with already. Anti-foreigner sentiments, anti-Semitic conspiracies, anti-Muslim attacks, all are apparently the counterpoint to what we've seen on the plus side in many communities, of people coming together and helping each other out. It's entirely your choice which of those two phenomena you focus on and amplify. We should always resist the intuition to do dumb stuff because we're scared and we want someone to shout at. However, more important than all of that ground level blame game is the geopolitical tussle going on for leadership of the world. And that's not hyperbole. The war of words between President Trump and China is still the centrepiece, of course. Trump has understood that the key to his re-election will be whether the American people blame him for the hard times that are going to be falling across the country, or whether they will join him in blaming China. Key to this is the claim made by Trump that there is credible evidence that the virus didn't begin life at a wet market in Wuhan, but it instead escaped from a virus laboratory in Wuhan, an event which China has been actively covering up ever since. This week he pushed the theme several times, saying, probably it was incompetence, somebody was stupid. If that was actually proven to be correct, it would be a crushing blow to the prestige and reputation of China globally. I mean, it would be huge. Not because of the accident, but because of the denial and the cover-up. To cover up a slow response to a random event is one thing, not to excuse that in any way. But to cover up your own culpability in the origin of something like this, that would be in a completely different league. Right now, there's no evidence either way. If you've decided to believe in one version rather than the other, fine, but all you're doing is expressing a personal preference for what you want it to have been. You can't ignore the fact that the US administration has a massive incentive to seek to cast blame on the Chinese government, and people do follow incentives. That doesn't mean it can't have come from a laboratory in Wuhan. We know that there's no genetic evidence that the virus was created in such a laboratory. It originates from an animal source, but whether it could have been isolated in such a laboratory for an experiment, that's entirely feasible. Will we ever get definitive proof either way, beyond reasonable doubt? The odds have to be heavily against it, but there may well be claim and angry counterclaim traded over varying degrees of persuasive circumstantial evidence. In the meantime, China's fighting back like a cornered tiger. Of course, it's dismissed the words of Trump and Mike Pompeo saying that they're blaming China to cover up US failings in its response to the outbreak, but it's also been aggressively responding to other countries with the apparent aim of dissuading them from lining up alongside America. Although the EU hadn't actively blamed China for the outbreak, it's nevertheless seen an aggressive approach on a number of fronts, according to Politico. Beijing attempted to pressure the European External Action Services, the EU's foreign service, to water down a report that showed Chinese involvement in spreading conspiracy theories. That was unsuccessful. Separately, Chinese diplomats have spread claims that the virus originated in Italy and tried to get German politicians to praise China's crisis management. Chinese diplomats in France ridiculed the ability of democracies to respond to the emergency. Why has it been so aggressive? Partly it could be panic, as the country's ability to deflect worldwide blame for a massive crisis seems to be weakening by the day. This could be seen in China's aggressive response to countries like the UK and Australia, which have supported calls for an independent inquiry into China's role. Partly it could just be genuine anger at the insult to Chinese pride, particularly by the tone of some of the American attacks, which are so completely different to anything you would have gotten pre-Trump. And partly it could be calculation. At a time when China sees both the US and the EU as being in a weakened state, it's made little secret of its ambition to fill in the vacuum of world leadership left by the US, as Trump has pulled it back from its traditional role. To underline that fact, China successfully humiliated the EU over an open letter by EU ambassadors calling for warmer ties between the two powers, in what was seen by some as part of a European attempt to take the global initiative. China insisted, and Brussels backed down and agreed, that the letter should be censored before being published in China Daily, the official government newspaper. The published version deleted references to the deadly coronavirus originating in China and spreading worldwide from there. Some of the European nations weren't really very happy with the EU's capitulation, and their embassies in Beijing published the full letter separately. Europe's Foreign Service said that it had changed the wording only reluctantly and had done so because it was important to stress the benefits of EU-China cooperation on climate change and sustainability, human rights and multilateralism, and the global response to the coronavirus. The point of all this isn't really who's right and who's wrong. It's that what we're seeing now is the historical disruption. This pandemic has destabilised the global status quo, arguably a status quo which was already under strain from a variety of directions. The key global players, the US, the EU and China, are actively jockeying for position. Russia's a wild card floating around, slightly distracted at the moment by its own experience of a pandemic, but of course always looking for opportunities. And China right now is the driving force. It's building up its military with new nuclear submarines and warships, beginning to become more assertive in disputed international waters. This week it announced a big advance in its space program, with the launch of its most advanced rocket, successfully holding its program to build a space station and to send a first manned mission to the moon by 2030. Change is in the air. We may see some early signs of how this looks when we make a breakthrough for a COVID-19 vaccine. At a summit on Monday this week, global leaders pledged resources for the process of developing a vaccine. The US didn't take part, and China at the last minute sent an ambassador rather than the Prime Minister, and neither country made a pledge. Who discovers the vaccine? And then how that does or doesn't get shared globally, it's going to be a real pressure point. If the US gets it first and is slow to share it, that will be catastrophic to its global position. If China gets it first and is quick to share it, that could also be catastrophic to America's global position. If China gets it first and is quick to share it only with countries that toe the line, now that'll be a real test of principle that some countries would probably fail. Don't think none of those scenarios are impossible? Britain and the US issued a joint warning yesterday that rival states are engaged in cyber attacks on research institutions linked to coronavirus, trying to steal secrets from around vaccine work. State-based hackers have been traced back to China, Russia and Iran. All the signs are there that we're on the threshold of a major new period in human history, where power relationships will be redrawn, and what is or isn't possible when it comes to global issues such as the environment and climate change is going to be entirely dependent on how all of that falls out. And that matters, because while human politics goes on its merry way, the natural world is completely oblivious to such machinations and isn't waiting for any of them. So here's a question to which we don't yet know the answer, about as far away from coronavirus and global politics as you'll get, but maybe a reminder that climate change is still a thing. What's happening to the insects? They play an essential part in the natural system on which we depend. A while ago we were all assailed by claims of a forthcoming insect apocalypse. As I showed in a video at the time, those headlines were sparked by fairly poor quality research, which was criticised by a number of entomologists. The main challenge we have when it comes to insect populations worldwide is that we really don't know what's happening in most locations. Insects may be thriving, they may be declining. In a few locations we do know, and a significant number of them are clearly declining. You have to be careful with that because in nature some species decline and others take over and dominate. That happens all the time. A niche opens up, something well adapted moves in to fill it. If you only record one species, you might miss the fact that they're declining because something else is out competing them. Nevertheless, numerous studies have shown declines in a number of insect populations, and the majority of evidence so far has linked those declines to habitat loss. And in some places we've seen restored habitats resulting in increasing in populations. So although a lot of scientists posit that climate change may become a contributory factor in insect decline, so far it hasn't emerged as a current cause. Or has it? A new study was released this week looking at grasshoppers on the Konza Prairie in Kansas, US. The prairie as a habitat has not been being destroyed, but the grasshopper numbers have been declining nonetheless, down by a third over 2 decades. Neither habitat loss nor insecticide use can explain that decline. The researchers have offered a new hypothesis, and although it doesn't involve actual climate change, it does involve the increase in CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. You remember that when I did my video on CO2 is plant food, that we believe the world has bulked up on greenery to some degree over recent decades because of enhanced CO2 in the atmosphere. Now some of that global greening is due to forest planting in India and China, but some is thought to be due to CO2. I also mentioned in that video that there was an effect that some had detected, which was that the extra quantity of growth was not matched by nutrient content. In environments where there's only the same number of nutrients in the soil to feed the plants, because it's what's absorbed from the soil that's really the plant food, then you tended to get greenery that was less dense in nutrients. When you get CO2 added to commercial plants in a greenhouse environment, you also get optimized nutrition provided to those plants by the growers. But that's not what happens in nature, obviously. When I covered that, personally I expected that meant a marginal lowering of nutritional value, say, 10%. More of academic interest, except in the toughest environments where nutritional needs are barely being met. But the researchers in this study looked at the concentrations of different nutrients in the vegetation, samples of which have been kept over the last 30 years. They found that during that time, the amount of grass had roughly doubled, but that its nitrogen content had fallen by more than 40%, phosphorus by nearly 60% and sodium by 90%. This led them to suggest that the grasshoppers might actually be suffering from a diet of the insect equivalent of junk food. Lots of empty calories. Now, it remains a hypothesis, in spite of the fact that some of the headlines of stories reporting that have lunged once again for the apocalypse word. Questions in my mind are to do with that massive drop in nutrition. Are we really sure there's no concentration effect in stored grasses over time that could make the impact appear more dramatic than it is? Because a 90% drop of anything seems huge, not proportionate to the extra growth effect that we're talking about. What other signs would you expect to see in grasshoppers if they were genuinely starved of nutrients? Do we see any of those signs? These are prairie grasses we're talking about. Are they more susceptible to these effects than other types of plants which respond quite differently to enhanced levels of CO2? Since CO2 is a global phenomenon, can we replicate this in another similar but geographically distant location to discount the possibility of some localized cause? Those are all questions that you'd want to answer before anyone starts running around flapping their arms about saying that the insect apocalypse is upon us. But the fact that something is just a hypothesis doesn't mean it can't be true. In the past, we had flourishing flora and fauna at higher levels of CO2 than today, for sure, but those changes happened over evolutionary timescales. So creatures adapted to fit into the ecological niches over hundreds of thousands of years. If a hypothesis was true, the question would be how that rapid change would affect the insect populations. Are there competitors that would cope better with the changed circumstances in the short term, that would move in to take over from those that lost out? Or are these changes all taking place too quickly? Nothing yet exists that could exploit the current circumstances. We're a long way from knowing the answer to any of those questions. Given how important insect life is to the health of the environment on which we ourselves depend, we need to find out more. So, something to think about. Have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show.